Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Lauren Barham. I'm the marketing manager here at SciBite and I'll be your host for today's session. So today we'll be covering an introduction to the concept and use of ontologies within the life sciences. I'm here with today's presenter, SciBite's head of ontologies, Jane Lomax. Jane has over 15 years experience working with biomedical ontologies, mainly at the EBI and Sanger. She's been a key developer of the gene ontology, and she has a PhD in genetics from the University of Cambridge, and she's been with us since 2016. So I just wanted to go through a little housekeeping before we get started. Please feel free to post questions throughout the webinar. You can type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel. We'd love to hear from you today, and we'll go through any questions in a short Q&A session at the end of the webinar. I also wanted to let you all know that a recorded version of the webinar will be emailed across to you by close of business tomorrow. And also that we have another webinar coming up towards the end of this month on the 22nd of May, giving an introduction and demonstration of our brand new ontology management platform, Sentry. I'll give you a few more details about that at the end. So for those of you who have just joined us, hello and welcome. My name's Lauren Barham. I'm the marketing manager here at SciBite. But without further ado, I'll now pass you over to SciBite's head of ontologies, Jane Lomax, to get started with today's webinar.
Hi, thank you, Lauren. So I'm Jane, and what we're going to talk. First slide. This is what we're going to talk about today. So a little bit about some of the challenges faced by life science companies and how using ontologies might be used to address some of these challenges. A bit about what an ontology is and what it can be used for. What ontologies and vocabs are out there in the biomedical domain. A bit about mapping, building and managing ontologies, and then finally a bit about what we do with ontologies at SciBite. So, as we all know, biological data is getting bigger and bigger, and over the last 20 years, new technologies are making it easier and cheaper to generate bigger and bigger volumes and different types of data. So once we had only sequence data, we've now got expression data, metabolomics, metagenomics, variant data, every sort of omics. And then on the horizon, we've got things like whole genome sequencing and single cell sequencing. And so with that growth, that enormous growth in data, comes with it the need to be able to search and to integrate and to be able to analyse it in scalable ways. And this figure comes from a 2015 paper from EBI, and it shows the growth of data within the EBI resources. So alongside this growth in data, you also have some of the following challenges like within organisations. So first of all, large amounts of unstructured legacy data, by which I mean sort of text or data sets with no or poor metadata attached. Disconnected data silos, so these might be in a large organisation, these might be from acquisitions where the data is disconnected, and so that valuable data isn't able to be accessed sort of across the silos. Cases where you have multiple competing standards within the same domain, so you might have a species list in your LIMS system, a different species list in some experimental database, and then something else again in your ELN. And no way to sort of communicate between them. So you might have homegrown internal vocabularies that have evolved over time by people adding to them, but they're not mapped out to a sort of open public standard. They're just internal. And you might have more than one of these internal vocabularies for the same sort of thing. And then the entry of metadata around data sets not being controlled, so that the metadata is patchy and heterogeneous, or more likely there's no metadata at all attached to those data sets. And I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with some of these issues. It's what we see a lot with our customers. So this is an illustration from EBI's ENA resource. So that's the nucleotide archive at EBI. So you might think that there's a fairly limited number of ways of describing, a sample as being male, but this shows that isn't the case, and this is over 50 different ways that they had submitters describe a sample as being male. One of them which is an entire paragraph, but it gives you some idea of the scale of the problem, and this is something we see at SciBite an awful lot. So I'm going to explain how applying ontologies and standards can enable you to share your data more easily across an organisation by using ontologies and standards. So they can make your data more interoperable by normalising to a central ontology ID. That's both within an organisation, but also potentially with external data. So if you wanted to integrate transcriptomic data from Geo, for example, with your own internal data, if you apply consistent open standards to that, then that's a much more achievable kind of proposition. They help to make your data more reusable, adding value within an organisation, because obviously data is a really valuable asset. They help you to sort of like the process of applying ontologies will help you spot errors in your data. So things like missing data, incorrectly labelled data. And they also allow you to sort of clean and harmonise your data for further downstream analysis. So things like AI algorithms or machine learning. So once your data's annotated cleanly, it makes your machine learning much more likely to be successful. And all of these sort of things combined means that you're well on your way to making your data fair, so findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable, which is something we hear a lot about at the moment. So to just take a step back for a second and talk a little bit about what an ontology actually is. So first and foremost, an ontology is a human-generated model. It's created by humans, but it's readable by machines. So it's a way that humans can explain how they understand the world, how things exist in the world, and how they interrelate. It should be a community consensus. And by that, I mean, it's not like a single person's view of a domain, which shouldn't be. It should be one that reflects the current scientific understanding as agreed by that community. And that's one of the reasons why building ontologies is so difficult. And I speak from experience, is that you have to get like subject matter experts, get the scientists to actually agree with each other about what something is. And it might sound, easy in the first instance, but actually when you try and figure out, exactly what gene means, try and pin it down, it's surprisingly hard. And so an ontology is structured as classes, so that like classes of things, types of things, and the relationships that operate between them, and often like logical constraints as well that operate on those classes and relationships. So the figure here you can see is an excerpt from the Uberon anatomy ontology. This is a species-independent ontology which describes anatomy. And you can see the different coloured arrows are different types of relationship that operate between the classes. So that organ is a type of anatomical structure, that the lung bud develops from the lung, for example, and the alveolus is part of the lung. So there's lots of different relationships operating there. I mean, ontologies are in biology, in life sciences, are typically very complex just because biology is very complex. So there's a lot of knowledge to kind of embed in there. So it's ironic, but ontology, something that's supposed to sort of normalize semantics, often gets used in very ambiguous ways to mean any kind of sort of controlled vocabulary or list or taxonomy. When in fact you can be thought of as more of a spectrum, so ranging from artifacts with weak semantics through to artifacts with very, very strong semantics. And it's important to note that there's no kind of inherent value judgment here about whether something is better because it has stronger semantics. That's not the case. It's more that using the right tool for the right job. So if you've got a shopping list, there's no reason why you'd want to attach a hierarchy or sort of, you know, logical axioms to that. You can just have it as a list, and that serves its purpose perfectly well. Whereas if you want to represent like some really complex biology, an ontology is probably what you mean. And when it comes to very large ontologies, things like the gene ontology, which I used to work on, you actually need that kind of those logical constraints, because they help you to build the ontology in a logical and consistent way. So if we sort of have a look at some of these different categories. So at the bottom, we start with lists. And other ways of saying this is folksonomy, which is kind of a collection of tags that you might apply, which helps you kind of search and tag your data, or control the vocabularies. And this could be things like lists of compound IDs that you have. There's nothing else attached to them particularly. It's just an list of IDs. And then we move up to glossaries or dictionaries. So these are still lists. There's no hierarchy associated, but they have natural language definitions associated with them. So some examples here might be Chembl, the drug database, where you have like a chemical structure associated, or Hugo gene names. And then we move up to sort of through loose hierarchies, loose classifications, through to thesauri, which are more synonym focused. So they're like different words that mean the same thing. But they also can have a hierarchy associated with them, not a very formal hierarchy. So we sort of talk about the sort of SCOS, broader, narrower relationship. So we're not saying that something has this very specific relationship, but we know that it's broader, or we know that it's narrower. So we can have this kind of loose hierarchy associated with it. And some examples of those would be SciBite vocabs, mesh, and medra. And then up to the slightly more formal taxonomies and meronymies, which use the sort of more strictly defined is a relationship or part of relationship, which can be described in RDF format. So an example of this would be the NCBI taxonomy, which is a strict sort of subclass, is a hierarchy. And then finally, up to ontologies themselves, which are very formal descriptions of a domain, with classes, as I've said, and relationships that operate between them, usually some logical axioms in there as well. And there's a variety of ways of describing an ontology, but one common way is the web ontology language, or OWL. And some examples of formal ontologies would be the gene ontology, human phenotype ontology, the EBI's experimental factor ontology, and the Uberon anatomy ontology. So you can see that by aligning to an ontology ID or URI, it's not the same as just aligning on a word or a number. I mean, that in itself is massively useful, because it improves interoperability, and it gives you like the opportunity to sort of align both like within your organization or potentially outside your organization if you're using some sort of open vocabulary. But with an ontology class, it also means something. You can ask questions about. There's some biological knowledge that's embedded behind that you get for free just by using that URI. So you get access to all that additional information. You can see here from this example that a HeLa cell line, you can see it's derived from humans, epithelial cells, and it's a cervical cancer cell line. So you get all that extra information for free, and you can make queries of that. And it reflects the sort of the state of the art, the state of understanding of that scientific community. The use of ontologies can also be really valuable in strengthening your machine learning or AI strategy. And that can be in several different ways. One way is to help develop training sets, as in these two examples. In the first, that we see that they've used the kind of Chinese version of the UMLS, which is a large structured vocabulary of medical terminology developed in the US, but this is the Chinese version, to kind of organize and unify their data, like things like different synonyms, and to provide a kind of skeleton for the, upon which the AI can operate in order to get their scientific results. In the second example, they restrict their answers to certain categories. These are sort of anatomical locations in their question and answer system, so that the answers are constrained. The patient answers are constrained. Ontologies can also be used to normalize the data going into AI or machine learning by, so the machine knows what type of entity it's seeing. So this particular thing is hedgehog the gene and not hedgehog the spiky animal being described. And you can also use them to validate your output because they're essentially gold standard human models. So you can validate the results coming out of your AI algorithms that way. Ontologies are also a key way in which the FAIR principles can be applied to your data. So this recent PwC report was commissioned by the EU, and they estimated the cost of not having data be fair within the EU to be 10 billion euros a year. So fair data, I mean, it's not just a nice idea. It's something that has a real sort of commercial value for an organisation as well. Which is why we're hearing so much about it at the moment. So FAIR is about making data findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable, all of which using ontologies plays into. So if you're able to annotate your data with ontologies and standards, you're well on your way to making that data fair. So this is an example of a real world situation that we're involved in, where we were able to help one of our customers, BMS, to apply ontologies as part of their metadata capture system, which is their AIM system. So the application uses ontology-driven data entry, so these kind of autocomplete fields. And behind these, so you sort of start typing, and it gives you a list of ontology terms. You come in with whichever synonym you've chosen, but it always normalizes to the same URI behind the scenes, and that URI is from, in this case, the bioassay ontology. And so it makes data entry easy. You haven't got to navigate any sort of tree. You've got a really nice sort of autocomplete function, and then behind the scenes it's doing all the hard work with the ontology itself. Okay, so moving on to the biomedical ontologies that exist out there in the world. So this is a kind of a bit of a history of biomedical ontologies. So starting as early as 1960, when MESH was first published. So MESH is the medical subject headings developed by the NIH in the US. And MESH is a really good example of, the right tool for the right job. So MESH isn't an ontology; it's kind of more of a sort of loose taxonomy, but it works perfectly for the purpose for which it was designed. So it's used to tag scientific documents in Medline. And it's very, very broad. It covers all sorts of scientific domains, and it's quite deep in some parts as well. So yes, it's been around a long time. That's the first one to be developed. Then some of the clinical standards are also very old. So SNOMED's been around since around 1965, and I think that's been driven by the need to kind of normalise clinical descriptions for medical billing in the US. So that's the reason a lot of the clinical standards arose quite early on, and equally for ICD, the International Classification of Disease, which is developed by the World Health Organization. That's what they use to kind of normalize the way that they measure and describe disease all over the world. So that's been around since 1969, and ICD-10 has been around since 1994. So skipping on to some of the ontologies proper. So the gene ontology was the first of these in 1998, the granddaddy of them. And then shortly, but sort of 3 years afterwards, the OBO sort of community was born. And the OBO community was an attempt to create biomedical ontologies that kind of worked in an interoperable way with one another. So there's lots of different rules and standards to that apply as if you want to be part of the OBO community. So ontologies are non-overlapping. They have to use kind of standard formats, and they have to adhere to certain standards like having textual definitions, and they have to interoperate cleanly. So if two ontologies have the same class, it should have the same URI. So that's a quite nice set of ontologies to use because they interoperate quite well. The NCI Thesaurus ontology version was published in 2003, and then the first experimental factor ontology came around in 2008, as did human phenotype ontology. And then between 2009 and 2017, there was a big growth in like new OBO biontologies. So it went up from 60 to 155. So there's loads out there, and that's growing all the time. So that was back in 2017. And the field itself now, the biontologies field, is kind of 20 years old. So it's a fairly established kind of scientific field in itself. But with that kind of expansion comes like another problem. So this is a screenshot from BioPortal, which is the US kind of repository for biontologies. We've got there's the URL for it at the bottom there. The EBI also has a great ontology service called the OLS. I put the URL there. So those are great places to find like what ontologies are out there. So if you look in BioPortal, and for health ontologies, you find 169 ontologies relating to health. So it's kind of hard to know where you would even start in that situation. So these are some of the things that you might want to consider when choosing an ontology. So first of all, is it suited to my data? Do the entities in my data match up well with what's in the ontology? Because you want to avoid using multiple ontologies within the same domain, because you're going to end up with lots of redundancy where they sort of overlap with each other. So you want to ideally just choose one thing that covers your data in the best way possible. Is it maintained? So does someone care about this ontology? Is someone going to look after it long term? Is anyone going to, if I put a ticket in, is there anywhere to put a ticket? And is anyone going to answer it if I want a new term or if I've uncovered an error? Or worst case scenario, is the whole thing going to be deprecated at some point in the future? Update frequency. So how often does the ontology get updated? How big are those changes? And how am I going to handle those changes internally if they are frequent? Is it interoperable with other ontologies? So does it overlap with other ontologies, and are those overlaps handled cleanly? So that's one of the advantages of using the OBO Foundry ontologies that I've described, is that they handle that kind of interoperability very cleanly. Another way that you could handle that would be to use something like an application ontology, like the EFO. So an application ontology is where you take chunks of lots of different other kind of reference ontologies and sort of glue them together with some of your own terms in there as well to cover a particular domain very, very well. So the experimental factor ontology covers the kind of the metadata associated with transcriptomics experiments. And so they've handled that kind of interoperability between those different ontologies for you by using that. And that's what's used behind the Open Targets initiative. Another consideration is licensing, especially if it's going to be built into something and your product's going to be redistributed. Most clinical standards are licensed, but even some of the open standards, it's worth checking the license, because they have some of them have you can't modify them and then redistribute them. What's already been used within my organization. So there's no point in reinventing the wheel. So if your organization is already using like Medra elsewhere, for example, it might make logistical sense just to carry on using that as well, even if it's not ideal for your purposes. Or if you're using a homegrown standard, does it make sense to keep on using that, or do you want to try and map out to some external standard? And then finally, if you're generating some sort of user-facing tool, what are your users asking for? What do they want? So something like ICD-10 might not be ideal for your purposes, but if that's what your users want, then you might just be stuck with that. Or at least you might want to take it on board. Okay, so that brings me neatly on to mapping ontologies and building and managing ontologies. In an ideal world, there would be one standard or one ontology per domain, and this is something that the Obo Foundry aims to do. But in the real world, this isn't always the case, and especially in the clinical domain, you end up with multiple overlapping standards. And so one of the things you may have to do within an organisation is to be able to pivot between those different standards. It's like either between your standard and a public standard, or between different public standards. And there's some great tools and resources out there. The EBI's OXO resource, which is a kind of which pulls in lots of ontologies and attempts to create mappings between them based on the cross references from the ontologies themselves. Is a great resource, and at SciBite we also have some great tooling to help map between ontologies. But the take home here is that ontology mapping is really hard, and it's generally lossy. So ontologies tend to have different kind of emphasis. So you might find that it's rarely a one-to-one mapping. It's often a one-to-many mapping, and so you find that if you're transforming from one to the other, you're losing information. You're losing annotations. So it's to be avoided if possible, but sometimes it isn't unavoidable. So I've been involved with a project coordinated by the Pistoia Alliance, which is attempting to provide reference mappings for some of the major biomedical ontologies. It's been run in collaboration with EBI, and the mappings are going to be made available through the OXO tool. And as is the algorithm that's used to generate them, which is called PAXO, I believe. So the phase 3, which was completed at the end of last year, was around phenotypes and disease, and there's a paper that's under review at the moment about that, and there's more info on the website there. So phase 4, which is already underway, is to do with lab analytics, so assays and chemicals. So if there's any organisations listening who'd like to get involved with that, or kind of future evolutions of this project, do get in touch with Ian Harrow, who's in the photo there. He's always looking for potential kind of volunteers and funders. So it's funded by a consortium of pharma companies at the moment and SMEs, and so he's always looking for new contributors. So once you've chosen and started to implement your chosen ontologies, you then need to consider how you're going to manage those. So your ontologies and vocabularies might be from several different sources. It might be from a managed external provider where they have very formal and scheduled releases like SNOMED, which is, and it also requires a license. It might be imported from the less sort of strictly managed things like the sort of Obo ontologies, which change more frequently, or you might even have developed your own ontology for if you have some of your own internal proprietary data, like strain names, for example. You might want to keep those internal, so it wouldn't make sense to use a public ontology in that case. You might have some business vocabularies in there, compound IDs, company names, that kind of thing, and then ad hoc lists that you might develop for a sort of short-term project that you need to sort of pull together and manage somehow. So these are some of the requirements for an ontology management system. Governance is really important within a large organisation. You want to know who's done what to a particular ontology and when, but that shouldn't be too onerous because you want to be agile. You want the ontologies to be developed, otherwise they'll sort of stagnate. They need to be versions such that you can roll back to a previous version if you need to for sort of regulatory reasons or scientific reasons. And even if it's not a formal version, you need to kind of be able to do that. You need to be able to control access for individuals and applications, but that obviously needs to be flexible because you need to add more people all the time, and software applications need to be able to access the various ontologies as well, or parts of ontologies. And it's also good to allow subject matter experts to be able to sort of suggest changes to the ontologies and then be able to incorporate those, but not allow them direct access so people can break things, but encourage them to sort of contribute in a clean way. And finally, it's nice to be able to use public standards for reasons we've discussed, but to be able to handle updates to those You know, so you might have a version of a public, a version of mesh that you're using internally that you've added some stuff to. So how do you then reconcile the changes that have happened to mesh in the meantime with that forked version that you've created in a clean and sensible way? So those are some of the considerations. And so James is going to talk a bit more about this in more detail at the webinar later on this month, that I think that's been heavily trailed, that Lauren's going to give details for at the end of this webinar. So finally, on to how we use ontologies at SciBite and what we do with our technology. So we use ontologies in lots of different ways. But one key function is to automatically annotate scientific text with ontology terms. And this is a kind of like overview of how we do that. We go through that process. So we take ontologies or vocabularies from the public domain. And ontologies, and like open standards and ontologies are brilliant, but they're not particularly well suited for entity extraction, for named entity recognition in text, because they typically don't have a huge number of synonyms. We found that on average most ontologies don't have about one synonym per entity on average. So what we need to do is expand that sort of synonym sort of capacity. We do that automatically by using a variation engine. So we write rules to sort of rearrange words. So breast cancer and cancer of the breast are automatically generated from one another, for example. So we increase the synonym search space that way in a machine way. We also use linguistic rules, specific linguistic rules, so that hedgehog the gene is different to hedgehog the spiky creature, and the rules look at the context around that, where that hit is found, and then decide which one it is. And we do this by human curation, so by life science experts, but we also leverage machine learning techniques to do this as well. So we have the best of both. We take out some of the, we do some of the harder stuff by using human, and then some of the sort of more mundane stuff we can automate. And then the vocab, so this gets turned into a site, so we call it a vocabulary, and then this can get used within Termite, which is our named entity recognition engine. So so the vocabularies are combined with Termite, and so this allows you to send any sort of text to the Termite API. Everything is API based, so this can be PDF, spreadsheets, even whole databases can be sent to the Termite API, and you specify the vocabularies, the ontologies that you want to annotate it with. And then you get back machine readable text. So that might be JSON, XML, that's semantically enriched. So that has your ontology terms annotated. And then this can be applied in all kinds of downstream use cases like enterprise search, pharmacovigilance, ELNs, connected data silos, as we discussed. So yeah, but that's probably for another webinar. So just finally, I'd like to thank the amazing SciBite team. It's great to work with such an amazingly enthusiastic and talented bunch of people. And there's everyone looking fine in their coloured t-shirts on our recent trip to Barcelona. So there we go. I think we'll be happy to take some questions now.
Yes, thank you, Jane. So we'll now go ahead and take some time for questions. Just a reminder, please be sure to type your questions into the question box in your Zoom control panel. Okay, so it looks like we have a few questions, so I'll just go ahead and ask those.
Yeah, do you want to just read them out to me, and then I'll try my best.
So the first question is, are there certain types of data or use cases where ontologies haven't been able to help with structuring data?
Sorry, yeah, that's a good question. So the answer is kind of. So natural language tends to be quite hard to apply ontology terms to directly, and I know that this is something that the human phenotype people have been trying to do, is like turn natural language into something that can be recognised as an ontology term. It is possible. It's not very it's not very easy to do, but that's probably one of the areas where you're kind of reaching the edge of the capability of applying ontologies, and you probably want to move into some sort of machine learning kind of space. And the other place it's difficult is doctors' notes, because doctors have all sorts of weird abbreviations for the way that they say things. So even though you could potentially normalize with ontologies, it's very hard to figure out which term applies when it comes to those sorts of clinical notes.
Okay, so next up, what do you see as the main challenges in reusing publicly available ontologies?
Thank you, Lauren. So what are the main challenges? So there's lots of challenges. A lot of it is which one, when there's lots out there, which is the best one to use, and I talked about some of that in the presentation. So yeah, knowing which one to use, coping with ongoing changes in the ontology. So it's not just the kind of small incremental changes, but sometimes there are big changes to ontologies. So I know that the sequence ontology, for example, is about to undergo a fairly major change in structure. So it's trying to keep on top of those kinds of things. There's another challenge is missing ontologies. So there's a lot of missing sort of space in the assay, in the world of assays. For example, there aren't good ontologies for in vivo assays, for example. So filling those gaps is really hard, and that's something we're working with some of our customers with. But yeah, that's a difficult thing to do.
Okay, so next up, how easily can you mesh semantic info with other types of data, such as chemical structures, which have their own visual or chemical ontologies?
Okay, that's a good question. So we have a partnership with Chemaxon at SciBite, and so they're able to recognise chemical structures in text, and so we can normalise those back to an ID, to an ontology ID. So that is possible. So yeah, via a partnership. So even though it's not directly in an ontology, we can normalise it back to an Inchi key or so on, and then map that to an ontology term in a straightforward way. If that answers the question. It's weird replying when people
Okay, so and another one. So what are the top 3 challenges you find when applying your platform to biomedical literature? Are you looking into building a machine learning model for your platform?
Yeah, so we use machine learning in all sorts of ways. So I'll answer the first part first. So what are the main challenges? Is I guess when the ontology doesn't cover what we need it to cover. So we have to sort of augment the existing ontology. So we have to kind of go in and add things, and that's sometimes a large process depending on what the gaps are. So adding synonyms and that kind of thing. Another challenge is very ambiguous phrases. So very, very short acronyms, for example, are problematic because PD seems to be an acronym for almost every different type of entity in some way or another. So having to sort of disambiguate that kind of thing is very hard. But yeah, so we are increasingly using machine learning capabilities as part of our kind of we only use machine learning where it's the right tool for the job, and in some cases it is the right tool. So we talked about natural language. That's an area we're looking at the moment. So looking at things like BioBert. We also use machine learning to generate synonyms for ourselves. So obviously the number of synonyms you could generate is potentially very, very large. So machine learning is one of the ways that we can do some of that automatically, and then go through and just check that those suggestions look sensible.
Okay, so I think we'll just do one more question. We've got quite a few coming in, but we'll do one more question.
Okay.
So is there an ontology that could join disease names between pipeline pharma projects and dysgenet?
That's a specific question. The answer is I don't know. I think I probably need to drill into that a little bit more. So if whoever asked that question wanted to get in contact with us via the help desk, we'd be very happy to kind of follow up on that with you. I don't know the answer off the top of my head, though, sorry. No, I think you've covered everything, Lauren. I think perhaps just the details for James's webinar.
We really appreciate you joining us today. If you would like to request a copy of Jane's PowerPoint slides, please drop us an email to the address that will be showing on your screen imminently. And a reminder that the webinar will be sent to you, a recording of the webinar will be sent to you by close of business tomorrow. So before we end, as I mentioned earlier, our next webinar is coming up on the 22nd of May. Our CTO, James Malone, will be giving a live overview and demonstration of our brand new ontology management platform, Sentry. You can register on our website or via the link that's on your screen now. Please do get in touch if you have any further questions. We obviously took as many as we could on this session. And also don't forget to follow SciBite on social media. That's on your screen also. So we would love to hear what you thought of today's webinar, and a short survey will open up in your browser after the webinar is finished. So please do take 30 seconds and let us know your thoughts. That would be really great. So thanks again for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time.